guess for me, a powerful starting point is the theory of late modernity that developed within critical sociology as an effort to recognize the nature of everyday experience, including people's experience, including children's experiences. So something like Anthony Giddens' approach to structure and agency and the importance of thinking about structuration processes, I still find helpful. I recognize this theory has been around for a while and some folk have moved on, but for me, it still captures the social and the psychological framing of children's experiences in their lives. And particularly in relation to the digital, I find Ulrich Beck's thought about the risk society very fruitful as a way of recognizing how risks are, in a sense, very much linked to technology as well as other things, but emergent from the actions of society and the actions of human beings. And then as a long-standing audience researcher, I'm always fascinated by the way, by thinking about processes of interpretation and, if you like, the kind of interpretive flexibility or the openness to multiple possible meanings of any text, technology, situation. And so I kind of draw on ideas around interpretation that informs my understanding of media literacy or digital literacy today, and the emphasis that I would put on processes of mediation. Indeed, it kind of takes me towards a processual view rather than a kind of a structural view.
I think of theory as kind of a flashlight. It helps you to search for the variables and factors that should be utilized in trying to explain something that you find interesting or important or problematic. And you can also differentiate between theories which tend to privilege one or a small set of factors, like behaviorism, which basically says, okay, if you see something going on, it's probably been reinforced by something else, and that's what you should look for, the reinforcement, versus something that I call conceptual frameworks, which put the flashlight on whole domains of variables that should be considered, and typically multiple domains of variables that should be considered. And I tend to be more favorable and comfortable with conceptual frameworks and rather than theories. So I'm going to talk primarily about conceptual frameworks and not so much specific theories. And I suppose that the conceptual framework that I am most comfortable with and I found most useful is something that's actually called a theory. It's called routine activities theory in criminology. But it actually is a conceptual framework. And it basically argues that when you're trying to explain crime victimization, you should look for the presence of a motivated offender, a suitable target, and the absence of capable guardians. Now, in my thinking about this concept of the motivated offender, I've broken this down actually into two portions: the motivation for the behavior and the undermining of whatever inhibitions might be present about engaging in that kind of behavior. So, you know, you have you want to, you're angry at someone, but you know that you shouldn't be, but you know, something makes it easier to actually go through with attacking them. In terms of suitable target issues, I've developed this concept into thinking about how children or crime victims in general become congruent to the motivations that offenders have. And I put those into three categories: vulnerability conditions, which means things that undermine their ability to defend themselves; gratifiability conditions, that is, things that make them really suitable to the particular motives that the offender might have; and antagonism conditions, and that is that the victim or the target corresponds to some particular kinds of antagonisms that the offender might have. And then the third element is this absence of capable guardians, which are the failures of environmental barriers and people in the victims, or in this case, the child's environment, to really be able to enact barriers to them becoming victims. And I think this is a kind of conceptual framework that helps us to understand things like harassment online, sexual exploitation online, the stealing of identity and hacking into people's technology. So it's a generalized conceptual framework.
A key observation in this respect from my personal work on media use is the notion that any kind, not only for children and media, any kind of research on media use for a very long time stayed with a media-centered perspective. We described audiences of particular media and asked the question, what are the people who use a particular medium? And then we draw conclusions from these kind of data. So because children use social media, this has the following implications. In any respect, I find this perspective really short-sighted because, and then the disciplinary background from a psychological perspective, my observation is the individual, as a rule, and not as an exception, as a rule combines different media. So the typical approach of research on media use is completely disappropriate in this respect. First of all, I have to ask, what are the media that a particular person uses, combines into something that I call, that is not a theory, not at all, but a heuristic concept, what I describe as a media repertoire. People are using, and children in particular, are using different media. So I have to make sure I cannot just be, it cannot be sufficient to say, to know if a child uses TikTok for certain kind of reasons. We need to know what else they use. Before I say, oh, that is a danger in itself if I observe my boy using computer games all the time. My first question would be, and what else does he do? As soon as you know what else, there might be completely different implications of the fact that, amongst others, this child is using online games. And that is my really first belief and my first interest in most of the research I'm doing, to first of all reconstruct the media repertoire in order to not to focus in a fast way on a particular medium, but to take the user-centered perspective and to ask, what do they combine? And that helps us to understand the meaning of a particular medium. Only this contextual approach to that.
Absolutely draw heavily on developmental psych. That is my go-to place to understand, particularly since I'm interested in children of different ages and how they respond to things. I always take that kind of developmental perspective. And so, yes, if there is a theories that I use, it's an understanding out of developmental psych, not just the grand theory, but if there's a theoretical description of the development of a phenomenon. Right now, for instance, executive functioning, which is something that develops in late toddlerhood, early elementary years, and is important as kids get older, how executive functioning works to influence whether kids become aggressive or not, how they react as victims of aggression. So I do look at a literature that may take a concept and describe it, because I think it's important for the phenomenon that I'm studying. And yes, I'd say that if there's a discipline that I use more than any other, it's developmental science.
So there's of course always some favorites the top 3 theories. But I think that my number one helpful theoretical approach is to look at some of these more overarching theories that can help explain seemingly interconnected or not even connected concepts of risk. So my particular favorite, which I find extremely useful, is Ulrich Beck's risk society thesis and all these concepts about late modernity. And it's not the risk part of the risk society theory I like. I like, there's less known and very underused in our field theory of institutionalized individualization. And for me, I think that's extremely helpful, and it's helping to contextualize and to elevate all these use of different theories and concepts across various risks and opportunities and media interactions to a more comprehensive understanding of what is going on a larger level. So yes, that would be my, if I had to just use one theory the rest of my life, that would probably be it.
I think there are theories that I use to help me make sense of the uncertainty that I feel myself. And again, this comes from a sort of a broad range of sources. I think, certainly complexity theory has featured very strongly in my thinking to date, in the sense that I think one of the things that I've been trying to think through is how can research with children about their digital media practices move with the pace of technology, but also children's own growth, and also indeed in relation to the pace of change at play in our cultures, internationally. So I think I've really been trying to sort of think with complexity theory there to sort of work out how we move with the times. And I think another key inspiration for me recently has been the work around resilience thinking and sort of, and I think that's, again, it's I guess you could configure it as a version of complexity theory, but actually what it's trying to do is really think about what does it mean to be resilient. And it's concerned not just with individual resilience, but actually community or collective resilience, which seems to me to be a major challenge lying ahead for all of us. A challenge, I should say, that I see technology as potentially playing a really important role in, right? I think technology, if harnessed well, and if we give our children the space to explore and experiment with technology in really interesting ways, that actually maybe it becomes part of a solution to some of the major challenges that are confronting us, whether they be climate change right down to, unaffordable housing or mental ill health or, a pandemic, for example, right? So yeah, I think there's a real need to be thinking creatively about complexity and to be channeling that into our work, because we are grappling with a complex world. And children, if we're thinking about children and their digital media practices, well, of course, they are growing up in a world that is ever more complex. And so, yeah, so we need some robust ways of theorizing complexity, I think. But also I'm also interested in, theorizing method, I guess. And I guess I take some inspiration from, methods like participatory action research, and so on. And I'm sort of really interested in thinking about how we perform togetherness, and how we, and indeed how we perform our differences in that togetherness, right? But also how we push our thinking forwards in ways that open up new creative possibilities for dealing with challenges.
When I started, I was very much part of that critical cultural studies environment that was also very affected by continental theory, postmodernism, and so on, which I do not disavow. I think it has very valuable insights to offer for the way we think. And yet at the same time, I was interested in conflict and struggle rather than in evolution and change, let's put it that way. And so lately I've come to take much more notice of the systemic and or systematic aspect of social life. And so really I think the concepts that I'm now working with start from what is not children for, but what is culture for. So what is culture for? Culture could be, you could answer that question so many ways, and people have over so many years. But here's one simple way of answering it. Culture makes groups. You learn the language of your family or your residential area, your place, and you become one with, identified with, part of, related to all the meanings, the stories, the folklore, the religion, the statecraft, the economics of that group. And culture makes those groups. That's what it's good for. It bonds people together in meaningful relationship groups. And many of these groups split off and turn into something different, and then they may well come into conflict. So culture makes groups, but that's not the end of the story because nobody belongs to just one group. And so there's this interaction among groups and the way in which groups contend or compete for preeminence in particular circumstances. So there's an important place, not only for culture making groups, but for culture being the place where untranslatable, incommensurable difference is navigated, negotiated, conflicted over, fought over. And that is where knowledge comes from. New ideas come from those encounters between incommensurate groups. An area that's now known as biosemiotics, which is the idea that life as a whole, right down to the cellular, microbiological level, up to the more complex forms of life, is coterminous with signs. So all of the things that are alive create and share and use information, and all the things that are dead don't. So the idea that life and signification, life and communication, life and semiosis are one and the same is a very interesting idea. And I think if we want to pursue it, you can't just say, well, it is or it isn't just like that. You have to pursue the idea. If you want to do that, then the role of children in developing signification and information and communication is crucial, because that's how you learn to reproduce the society, the species, the organism.